Good day and good night to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I will start taking again the observation by Gall Levy that Marx called attention when he said that economists won over the sociologists. Well, as someone trained in political science, I like to think of politics as a way to change market results. And that's actually what inspires the reflections I want to share with you today. Actually, I decided not to have a PowerPoint because I'm going to reflect on previous research I've done and what the pandemic led me to think about the results of my research. I would start saying that the general costs of inequality are seldom considered. It's not only that the economists, sociologists, anthropologists focus on the specific implications of inequality. It's even more within each discipline. There are sub-disciplines that further narrow the focus. Well, it's true that specialization allows for considerable knowledge or refinement, but it's also important to have in mind that in real life, experiences are holistic and not compartmentalized. There's no compartments separating them. In real life experiences, we always live holistic situations, no matter if social actors are conscious or not of the encompassing nature of the real world. With that, I'm not suggesting that we should all be converted into generalists, but my observation just call attention to the fact that in specific historical moments, emerging circumstances make us more likely to see society in a holistic way. Such conditions are usually brief critical junctures that open the door to greater uncertainty, but also throw lights into social interdependence and sometimes bring the opportunity for unforeseen policy innovation. In my view, the pandemic is one of such critical moments when multiple dimensions of inequality unveil their intersection as well their encompassing consequence for the whole society. I see the initiative of the World Pandemic Research Network as a great opportunity for us to think together, to generate progressive collective knowledge. I mean, collective knowledge that will contribute to further knowledge towards science-based evidence relevant for policymakers, but also could contribute to meaningful understanding for the general citizen, for the common citizen. Moving to my chosen topic, why to address social cohesion and inequality in an event whose subject matter is the ongoing pandemic. My long-term research on interests on inequality, it originates from the basic social theory question: how is society possible? What holds people together? Of course, there are solid literatures on contractual theories, be they inspired by Rousseau or by Hobbes, be they premised on natural inclinations among humans to cooperate, or else based upon utilitarian versions of the rational motivation to instrumentalize human interdependence. Recognize the relevance of both interest on the one hand and values on the other. I take them as the factors that cement the social bond. In the concept of norms, I also include institutions, I mean practices that are stable, valued, and recurring. At this level of abstraction, it's not difficult to answer the basic question about how is society possible. People are motivated by interests on the one hand, and by constrained norms, they're constrained by norms on the other. However, if theory provides comfort to the mind, empirical reality challenges us to answer for relevance as well. So taking into account those aspects, I sort of looked at the experience of Brazil to reflect on how interests and norms play their roles under the pandemic. Mentioning lessons from Brazil, I could refer to the many things that went wrong, so many things that time would be short. You certainly heard about the deliberate aggravating measures and the flow of fake news spread by Brazil's president and his supporters. You heard that Brazil was for quite some time the epicenter of the pandemic, and that the virus has already taken the life of over 600,000 people. But no, instead of focusing on the wrongs and misdeeds that contributed to aggravate the sanitary shock, I have chosen to look at the conditions and choices that have made possible, though to a limited extent, to mitigate the humanitarian crisis. Despite all the mistakes and wrong measures officially implemented or the ones not implemented, I think Brazil offers a good illustration of how both individual and collective decisions may respond to sudden challenging situations. Furthermore, I want to suggest that in some circumstances, emergency responses to crisis can make lasting contributions, not only to preserve social cohesion, but perhaps to create room for policy innovations toward a less unjust society. With this focus on inequality and the concern with social cohesion, I briefly consider why people enforce complementarity. Or back to the perpetual question, how is society possible? One way to seek this sort of inquiry is to focus on those disadvantaged. Why do the most disadvantaged social sectors not challenge the status quo? Why they not react and put the whole society in danger? This is indeed the usual frame orienting research on inequality among sociologists. The most famous sociological tradition in that perspective is the so-called culture of poverty inaugurated by Oscar Lewis back in the 1950s. Well, I'm acquainted with this perspective as well with the later developed literature about the prospects for and the obstacles to popular mobilization, social movements from below, etc. What I felt it was missing the picture was the view of those on the top. I mean, the focus of the so-called culture of poverty provides clues to the view from below, but if interdependence is what one wants to look at, I asked myself, how about exploring the view from the top as well? How those who control material and symbolic resources see the situation of the people at the bottom of society. This curiosity led me to focus on the perception of the elites about poverty and inequality. My choice has been mainly to look at interests as the ground that holds people together. From this perspective, instead of looking at social interactions as genuine predispositions to gift exchange, as in the Marcel Mauss tradition, for example, on reciprocity, I adopt the presupposition that their individual search for cooperation is motivated by the aim to attain their interests. Individuals search for complementarity, and this generalized need is what answers for the social bond. The curiosity about perceptions from those at the top of society and their implications for social cohesion led me to explore how elites conceive of poverty and inequality in both cognitive and normative terms. The ultimate concern of my research focus was actually to see how elite perceptions justify inequality, but also I want to inquire under what circumstances could they agree with measures to reduce inequality. My several explorations on elite perceptions are based upon survey analysis as well as in-depth interviews. I did that with business leaders, top politicians, and top bureaucrats, inquiring about their degree of information, explanation, and moral justifications for poverty and inequality, as well as their assessment of the consequences of acute inequality and policy preference to deal with it. To make the story short, the elite was unanimous in pointing out that Brazil was one of the most unequal countries in the world. They all review a very good knowledge about the data. They also repeated like sort of a mantra that Brazil was one of the most unequal countries in the world and that this was a shame, but in a way banalizing the fact that there was something natural to this sort of inequality. They also saw as very serious the negative externalities of inequality. But to deal with perceived externalities, they only consider strategies to privately protect their personal safety and individual property, instead of mobilizing collectively to secure some sort of general policy. They bet on private solutions to face threats. Those private solutions were naturally bulletproof cars, private guards, fences around houses and apartment buildings, cameras and alarm systems, gated community, the usual things. In the, let me cut some parts. I mentioned the vision of the elite that I captured in previous periods to the pandemic to call attention to the different picture that emerged last year in the initial months of the pandemic. Then the discourse about the prevailing levels of poverty and inequality, voiced on TV, on the press, and in social media, dramatically changed, and all the elite sectors were actively voicing the new discourse. One recurring comment in the public discourse at the time was that the pandemic had revealed to us how unequal Brazil was. To grasp the real meaning of this sudden realization, when the data on inequality had made headlines for decades, and while for decades everybody repeated that mantra that Brazil's record inequality was the highest in the world, one must acknowledge that the very persistence of so sharp inequalities had been responsible for creating separate living worlds. The one of the destitute and the rest, and the others. The extremely disparate life conditions and the horizons, life horizons between the poor and the non-poor acted to foster parallel worlds. I mean, the idea of social interdependence got blurred due to the wide social distance. While at the normative level, the notion of reciprocity had vanished in previous times, interdependence and reciprocity were deeply shaken with the outburst of the pandemic around April 2020. Suddenly, the contours of the well-settled frontier between cities and the lands in their periphery acquired new salience. The sudden awakening to the reality of inequality deserves qualification, I think. No doubt, the poor are more vulnerable not only to the infection, but also to all its socioeconomic consequences. They have no sewage, no access to clean water, no money to buy food, to buy masks. They must expose themselves to contagion in crowded public transportations, etc. I could go on and on listing the basics they are deprived of. But the point I want to make is that the awareness of such acute deprivation by the non-poor was ignited, particularly because they sensed that the precarity that the poor lived with brought the danger of putting in risk not only themselves, but the whole society. Like with any epidemic for which no preventive or curative medicine is available, COVID-19 made obvious to everybody, not just to the poor, that we are all vulnerable. On top of the awareness of the generalized vulnerability to the virus, there were also additional concerns. The uncertainty about the flow of goods and services in both the formal and the informal sectors, and the fear that social disorder could be the response of those severely afflicted by the aggravation of the hardships. This combination of perceived risks explain why bold mitigation strategies were quickly adopted to minimize negative externalities. In that sense, Brazil was one of the first countries to adopt emergency measures to counteract the impact of the pandemic. The previous direct cash transfer program, Bolsa Família, a legacy of the former progressive labor government, covering close to 50 million families, was not sufficient to respond to the crisis in the course. A larger number of families were now also thrown into vulnerability, and to attend those who suddenly lost their jobs, the benefit had to be larger than allocated by the previous program. So everybody, Congress was very quick in adopting those measures. The economic elite strongly backed them. So at the end of 2020, about 1/3 of Brazil's population have received emergency funds. The remarkable thing about the generous emergency benefit program is the speed that characterized its adoption. And of course, it was not a sustainable policy initiative. Unable or unwilling to use taxation, the government managed to trespass the limit imposed by the rigid legislation that regulates the ongoing austerity program, claiming the pandemic to qualify as a war situation. Well, now the government faced the challenge of securing resources to keep the flow of the benefit going on, since the pandemic is not over and the economy remains in dire conditions. Seeking re-election, which takes place next year, the president goes on fighting vaccines, masks, and social distance, but at the same time, he's seeking all the means. He's resorting to all sorts of pork barrel bargaining to secure funds to distribute as benefits in exchange for votes next year. Of course, there is not a sustainable plan to assist the poor, and clearly what is taking place is the destruction of the very successful former Bolsa Família established back in 2004, which contemplated a lower number of families, provided smaller grants, but also was much more oriented to promoting effective social inclusion. The point I want to make is that the deliberate dismantling of the former existing social programs promoted by the right-wing government, despite that, the social legitimacy of the former program forced the present government to seek alternatives to it to get popular support. The challenge is to offer something more attractive, even if short-lived, that's to say, until next year's presidential election. The relevant aspect here is that even if paternalistic and short-sighted, the plan in action testifies to the fact that no politicians dare to propose the end of direct cash transfer program. This fact is something to be taken into serious considerations for those who are involved in mobilizing citizens from below. But it's also something to be considered among those who do policy analysis and design. This is one of the developments the pandemic prompted in Brazil that allows for speculations about the future of social cohesion. Note, however, that the previous existence of a sound program of cash transfer settled the ground for the emergency program implemented under the pandemic. This aspect brings me back to the point about norms and institutions. Once institutionalized, norms and institutions can function to foster change. Contingent factors are what change makers must explore to enforce transformative policies in practice. The need to provide emergency support to the more vulnerable to the present existing sanitary shock may, under given circumstances, contribute to pressure for sustainable social policies to promote social inclusion. I will finish with a very brief mention to one more example from the Brazilian experience to reinforce my argument that deep-seated norms and existing institutions are valuable resources to promote social cohesion. I have in mind the peculiar fact that according to various opinion polls, Brazilians are remarkably pro-vaccines. The different polls show that between 94 and 97% of the population reveal the disposition to get the shots against COVID-19. Despite the deliberate efforts of the federal government to discredit vaccines, as well as masks, social isolation, we see that even many of the ministers and several other officers close to the extreme right president got vaccinated. They often do so secretly in order not to upset the President Bolsonaro. Since Bolsonaro openly spreads fake news about vaccines, saying that they modify one's DNA, causes AIDS infection, and other insane news. But Brazilians demonstrate against they may demonstrate against preventive measures that interfere with market activities, but they do not protest against COVID vaccines. If the country still has just around 65% of the population fully vaccinated, it is because the government actively managed to delay the acquisition of vaccines, not because the people avoid them. The propensity to be immunized has been sedimented through decades of active involvement of public health personnel to create the institutional structures so as to offer and administer vaccines for various diseases throughout the country, and the enforcement of persistent campaigns to convince people of the importance of preventing diseases. Of course, the two experiences I commented upon here are trivial ones. The clear perception of negative externalities of the pandemic leading to quick emergency support and the presence of institutionalized pro-vaccine culture are certainly no panacea, and Brazilians are still facing dire circumstances. But things could be much worse in the absence of the two experiences I consider here. One may also argue that the two examples I gave are no relevant lessons because they concern national Brazilian peculiarities. However, my answer would be that policy opportunities only arise under the peculiar circumstances that turn existing conditions into further possibilities anywhere. Of course, such turn demands politics and policy investments. As social scientists, we are not the ones to take the lead in this front line, but it is mapping out interests, needs, organizational conditions, etc., or doing policy analysis and policy designs that we provide knowledge resources that are crucial to convert contingencies into opportunities to reduce inequality and to strengthen the social bond. Sorry if I was too quick, if I was jumping from one issue to the other, but thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Elisa. This has been really, really great, and I think a nice finishing point for us as well to have a talk to think along. Without slides for a change. I think I would like to open the floor for questions now, to hear if anybody has a comment or a question. You can just raise your hand. Yes, Marc.
Yes, thank you very much, Elisa. I was struck when you described the situation, the initial situation in your investigation of the views of the rich people, thinking in terms of solutions that were mostly private protection devices. That's what we observed at the world level with vaccine nationalism and all that happens in terms of hoarding things for the rich countries and leaving the others behind. So I'm not quite sure how to phrase my question, but you were talking about situations where there is an opportunity for changing norms. So are we in such a situation at the global level or not? So are we stuck indefinitely with this nationalism and this egoism of the rich countries?
You know, I have reflected a lot about that. It's difficult to have a real solution, but it seems to me that if the economic crisis really afflicts people, I mean, if we have now new sorts of virus that prompt more and more catastrophe, I think in the end, the need to save oneself will demand the others. I mean, nationalism is something short-sighted. Mm-hmm. And of course, we have nationalist reactions because we don't have global governance. And global governance is something far from our horizon. But disasters can prompt some sort of a global administration of crisis. I've seen a similar example with positive connotations. You know, I have been doing this literacy service constantly. And in a 10-year interval, I found significant variations in the way Brazilian economic elites reacted to some more progressive policy, I mean, policy distribution policy. Originally, in 1993, they were extremely against any sort of measure that would imply a distribution. They would say that, no, once the economy, I mean, the classical trickle-down expectation. If there is progress, if there is growth, then everyone gets. Then 10 years later, in a different world situation, it was 2013, I did the same survey. And I found very significant change in the economic elite perception. Not all of it, but a significant part of it had realized that the economic prosperity Brazil was experiencing and the redistribution that the Labour Party was promoting, creating sort of a low middle class, created opportunities for everybody to gain. Finally, they saw a positive gain. Some gain was possible because enlarging the consumer market, a significant part of the economic elites could benefit from the well-being of the poor. In this 10-year interval, there was, I think, I don't remember, it was a huge amount of people who, for the first time, were able to get a banking account. And that, I mean, that market stimulus to consumption made the economic elites to change their mind, and a perception of positive externalities. This was even more visible because I had South Africa as a comparative case in the two moments. In South Africa, the economic elites went on thinking the same that they saw 10 years before, no redistribution before growth. But in Brazil, momentarily, I mean, positive externalities have generated a different way and a propensity even to change norms. So, I mean, it's no great hope, but perhaps if we face more and more disaster, we may finally find that the only strategy to survive is to perceive ourselves as a common world.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Elisa. These are very nice and wise words. Unfortunately, very, very pessimistic, but I do share that view as well. Unfortunately, Simon, you have your hand up as well.
Yes, thanks a lot for the inspiring talk and perhaps giving us a little more hope. If I understood you correctly, I think you said that interdependence and reciprocity were deeply shaken with COVID, but in the end, also awareness that everyone is vulnerable came out of the situation. But although I agree with you, I wanted to ask you whether you don't think that regarding interdependence and reciprocity, or more especially interdependence, this crisis was also a way to make us more aware of how everything and everyone was interdependent. not only the fact that suddenly the planet was getting better because we stopped all our activities and we started seeing more animals in cities and that kind of things, but we also saw that we were all interdependent in terms of economy and health. When, you know, I guess some kind of solidarity developed with health professionals. And we knew that we were really dependent on them, and if they fell sick, it was really a problem for everyone. And we saw that the you know, products coming from other countries were becoming more scarce, and that was posing a general problem. So I think all the interdependencies became a lot more pregnant, and everyone could feel that. So I just wanted to know what was your view on that, and how you think that might change people's mind in general.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I was clear enough because my English is not very, very good. But I mean, I was saying that, I mean, I agree with you. At the beginning, at the first moment of I think there was a strong feeling of generalized interdependence, and that helped a lot. But those situations, I don't think they are lasting. They are not lasting ones, because as soon as people find private ways of protecting themselves, or countries find a way to get their vaccines, they retreat to their own circle. Like, for example, even this thing of donating to the needy. It has been observed, not only in Brazil, but everywhere, that the flux of the wave of philanthropy is getting thinner and thinner because people get tired of it. Now, my consolation is that sometimes you have to use whatever exists to stretch that feeling of interdependence. Like, for example, like I was saying, Brazil has no way to say, I mean, the present government has no way to impose a sustainable program. But the need, his private calculation that he wants to be reelected forces him to strive for some sort of continuation. That's opportunistic, of course, and there comes the role of politics. Those people who are concerned about mobilizing society from the bottom up have to take advantage of that. They are the ones who have to insist in Congress level, in demonstration, whatever is possible. How can we force these decisions so that these decisions to distribute benefits get more sustainable, more inclusive? I mean, if we, in Brazil, if we manage to restore some of the features of the previous program of benefit, that's a great conquest. For example, everybody who received benefits before have to show proofs that the kids were at school and that the kids had their vaccination card updated. This has been disbanded by the present president, but it's there. People are used to it. If we insist on past practices, that's a way to push forward. I know it's piecemeal, but politics has to be piecemeal.
Great, thank you very much. Heriberto, you have your hand up as well.
Thank you. Eu gostei muito. Muito obrigado, professor. I have a comment and a question on your talk. Is great. So it's especially at the beginning of the pandemics in Brazil. It was very shocking for me to see how 2 ministers of health were fired in less than 6 months. Mr. Luis Enrique Mandetta and Nelson, I don't remember the last name, Nelson. Yes. So based on these very initial moments of the pandemic, so it was very clear that the policies of Brazil were really the most relevant or accurate. you may remember the president and the other minister of health, the military, I don't remember the name, announcing and promoting hydroxychloroquine.
Yeah.
So based on this, it was very interesting to me see the reaction of communities, especially in the favelas. The reports that I have at hand say that the favelas were controlling most of the public health policies at the communal level. So they converted schools into health services for the community. They hired doctors and nurses, and they have implemented all kind of measures to face the pandemics. So it seems to me that based on your talk, there was a previous social cohesion, social organization of the communities in Brazil. So, and it seems that this is very general in the literature of disasters. So there is a previous cohesion and social organization before the disasters. So this enters into action. But then in the case of Brazil, I mean, the magnitude of the crisis was so huge that I'm really interested in to see whether what is the future of this social cohesion, these communities in the next future, in the future of Brazil, especially in the action of these communities, these actors in the democratic civil participation. You mentioned the elections are coming up. How these communities will play in this broader landscape of social participation in Brazil. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. I mean, it's true that in the 16 years that the Labour Party was in power, they made a big effort to mobilize and to organize the poor population. I mean, not only the poor. The plan was to stress local organizations, and the local councils became very effective. There were local councils, health councils, youth councils, lots of organizations. They were quite effective to distribute this benefit that the government had. These councils were critical. People have the address of each individual, what the situation was. They almost could have a personalized orientation towards the clientele. This is not so virtuous because in the favelas there is competition with the other organized, which is the drug dealers. The drug dealers have strong control also over the favelas, especially because they exert police control. And there's a constant tension between these two things. Unfortunately, the present government does not combat the drug dealers and dismantle the councils. There is still the nucleus, people still know each other, so they help each other, but the councils as such are no longer into operation. And the president insisted on having a different list of beneficiaries instead of relying on the records that were already available. And this, of course, created room for lots of corruption, but it's there. Anyway, for next year, if the Labour Party gets back to power, probably they will insist in rebuilding all these institutions. Now, one never knows elections are always uncertain. The prospects are very positive for the Labour Party now, but that was a situation also in the previous presidential election where no one could predict that Bolsonaro would win. And he won, probably using fake news, probably benefiting from the from the fact that he was life-threatened with some crazy person who used a knife and stabbed him. But we are also in a situation of uncertainty. And of course, Lula is very popular right now, but the middle class, and also I suspect the upper class still has a strong prejudice against the Labour Party. There was a campaign to equalize the Labour Party to corruption. Of course, there was corruption, but there was corruption before as well. And the only ones charged are the Labour Party members. So these people who still think corruption is the brand mark of the Labour Party, they are trying hard to find a third alternative to Lula and Bolsonaro. It has not been easy because there are so many and they don't coalesce into a single candidacy because they are too different among themselves, and of course because they are too eager. Then the good chances are that the polarization will remain, and if that remains, Lula will be gaining power, and in the local communities will be revitalized. That's the visual scenery, but unpredictable.
Right, thank you, Elisa, once more. I know it's late already, well, late depending on the day, but it's late in terms of the conference timing. Would you allow me one more question?
Sure, please.
I've been wondering, you've been talking about sort of reciprocity disappearing and social cohesion lowering and not being there anymore. And I think we're observing this everywhere. And you've also mentioned that some of the politicians made mistakes with policies, either with doing things or not doing things. And we see this as well because it's not really easy to kind of come up with the correct policies externally. And so to me, then there seems to be this sort of this paradoxical situation where we need to source policies from the community to reify the community, if that makes sense. But at the same time, the community is being atomized, it's being individualized, personalization, how we live, how we consume information as well, if you want to look at social media, what we just got earlier. And now on top of that, we have masks, visibility, sort of metaphors of freedom of speech often come with the mask as well. We're forced to stay apart from each other. So what does this do to our society if we're animals at the end of the day that want to be together, right? And this is where the community-based and the policies that are functional at work will come from. Yet we are being forced to stay apart and being pushed apart further away.
You know, I think it depends a lot on the local cultures. It's possible to strive for more conviviality, even if we are apart. But of course, this has to be based on the elementary grounds of the culture. I think in my own culture, people are dying to embrace each other, to give kisses as we used to do to everybody. And given, as soon as the situation got better in recent weeks here, people started again meeting each other, of course, in different ways, still masked, but already closer. And I think the more it's possible, the more vaccines help us, the closer we will be. And I think each culture has to find out how to reapproximate people. And I don't think it's such an impossible thing. Many people think that from now on, we all prefer virtual meetings. I disagree. Not only because we like to see each other, but also because even from an economic perspective, I mean, the possibility to generate new ideas needs eye to eye. We can combine the two things, but face-to-face are still valued in any culture, I think. That, I think, is a general human trait.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very nice segue into me, first of all, thanking you very much for this, and I will thank you virtually with a virtual round of applause, but you get a real one as well. So thank you very much for your talk today.